In the summer of 1812, Europe held its breath. At the height of his power, Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte commanded an empire that stretched from Spain to the borders of Russia. Yet for all his victories, his control over the continent remained fragile. Britain still defied him at sea. The continental system, his great economic blockade meant to strangle British trade, was riddled with leaks. And at the eastern edge of Europe, Tsar Alexander I of Russia had grown tired of towing the French line. When Russia pulled away from Napoleon's economic system and reopened trade with Britain, the French emperor decided it was an act of defiance he could not ignore. He would force Russia back into obedience, not through negotiation, but with overwhelming military force. In June 1812, Napoleon assembled what was, at the time, the largest army Europe had ever seen. It was called the Grande Armee. Over 400,000 to perhaps more than 600,000 men, depending on how you count its many detachments and support troops. They were not only French. Italians, Germans, Poles, Dutch, and others marched under Napoleon's banners. This multinational army was an instrument of imperial power and prestige, and Napoleon was confident it could crush any resistance. To many in Europe, the invasion looked like the beginning of another swift and decisive French campaign. The plans seemed straightforward. Napoleon would cross into Russian territory, move quickly, defeat the Russian armies in a series of battles near the border, and force Tsar Alexander to the negotiating table. It was a pattern that had worked repeatedly in Central Europe. Yet Russia was not Austria or Prussia. Its distances were immense, its climate unforgiving, and its rulers and generals were prepared to fight by different rules. On June 24, 1812, the Grande Armée began crossing the Niemen River into Russian territory. As drums beat and eagles glittered in the sunlight, Napoleon is said to have remarked that from this moment on, 30 days of campaigning would be enough to bring the Russians to their knees. But from the start, small warning signs appeared. The roads were poor. Supplies lagged behind. The summer was hot and dusty, and tens of thousands of horses and men strained to move artillery, wagons, and baggage across a landscape that grew emptier with each passing day. The Russians, under generals like Barclay de Tolly and Prince Bagration, avoided giving battle near the frontier. Instead, they retreated, drawing Napoleon deeper into the country. Wherever the French advanced, they found villages abandoned, wells spoiled, and supplies burned. The Russians were adopting a scorched earth policy, sacrificing their own land and resources to deprive the invaders of food and shelter. It was a strategy designed to trade space for time, time for the Russian armies to unite, time for the French lines of supply to stretch thin, and time for the Russian climate eventually to become their ally. As the Grande Armée pushed eastward, the first skirmishes and engagements took place. At Smolensk in August, Napoleon hoped to bring the Russians to a decisive battle. The city, an important stronghold on the road to Moscow, became a battleground as French troops launched assaults and Russian forces defended the walls and suburbs. Cannon fire thundered, buildings burned, and streets were choked with smoke. In the end, the Russians set the town ablaze and withdrew rather than be trapped and destroyed. The French could claim possession of Smolensk, but it was a hollow victory. There was no decisive war-ending battle, only another stretch of charred ruins and empty countryside. Within the Grande Armée, fatigue and sickness were already beginning to take a toll. The columns marching along dusty roads had to contend with heat, lack of water, and a growing shortage of food. Foraging parties sent out to seize what they could from the countryside often returned with little. Horses, crucial for cavalry and hauling artillery, were dying in droves. Desertion, disease, and sheer exhaustion began to thin Napoleon's ranks long before they ever saw the Russian capital. And yet, Napoleon pressed on. For him, turning back without a decisive victory was unthinkable. Meanwhile, in Russia, pressure was mounting on the Tsar and his commanders. Many nobles and officers were frustrated by the endless retreats. They wanted a stand-up fight, a great battle that could show Russia's courage and perhaps halt the French advance. In response to these political and patriotic pressures, and with Napoleon approaching ever closer to Moscow, a plan formed to make a stand along the road to the ancient capital. The place they chose was near the village of Borodino, west of Moscow, along the Kaluga River. There, in early September 1812, Russian forces under the aging but respected commander Mikhail Kutuzov prepared their positions. They built earthworks, redoubts, and defensive lines along gently rolling ground intersected by streams and ravines. The most famous of these fortifications would be the Great Redoubt, a massive earthwork bristling with artillery. The Russians knew they were outmatched in some areas of discipline and experience, but they had numbers, strong defensive positions, and an iron determination to defend the road to Moscow. On the night before the battle, campfires dotted the landscape. Russian priests blessed icons and regiments. Soldiers prayed, sang hymns, and awaited the coming storm. On the French side, veteran soldiers sharpened bayonets, checked their muskets, and tried to snatch a few hours of sleep. Napoleon, suffering from illness, studied his maps by lamplight. He believed that the coming battle could decide not only the fate of the Russian campaign, but of his entire empire. On the morning of September 7, 1812, the Battle of Borodino began. At dawn, the first French cannon spoke, sending thunder rolling across the mist-covered fields. Soon, hundreds of guns on both sides joined in, unleashing one of the most intense artillery duels of the Napoleonic era. The air filled with smoke and dust. The ground shook under the constant explosions. French infantry and cavalry moved forward against the Russian positions, particularly targeting the flèches, small earthworks on the Russian left, and the Great Redoubt near the center. The fighting that followed was brutal, close, and unrelenting. Columns of French infantry, packed tightly together, advanced under withering fire, only to be cut down by Russian cannon and musket volleys. Those who reached the earthworks clambered up the slopes, bayonets ready, and fought hand-to-hand with the defenders in scenes of chaos and horror. Muskets served as clubs, bayonets flashed in the smoke, and men grappled among bodies and broken guns. Time and again, the positions changed hands. French forces, including some of Napoleon's finest troops, stormed the flèches and the Great Redoubt, only to be counterattacked by Russian infantry and cavalry who surged forward with shouts and battle cries. Both armies paid a terrible price. Entire units were mauled, regiments reduced to a fraction of their morning strength. Officers and generals fell alongside ordinary soldiers. The battlefield became a landscape of shattered trees, churned earth, and scattered bodies. Amid all of this, Napoleon faced a crucial decision. He had held the elite Imperial Guard, his last reserve, in the rear. To send them forward might tip the balance decisively in his favor, perhaps shattering the Russian army. Yet he hesitated, fearing that he might need them later in the campaign. As the day dragged on and the casualty lists climbed, the Guard remained largely unused. By evening, the Russians had been pushed back from many of their original positions, and their line was badly battered. The Great Redoubt fell to the French. Russian losses were staggering, but the Russian army was not destroyed. Under cover of darkness, Kutuzov ordered a withdrawal. The Russian forces pulled back along the road toward Moscow, bloodied but still intact and still capable of fighting. Napoleon had won the field of Borodino, yet it was a victory without a decisive result. The Grande Armee, too, had suffered immense losses. Tens of thousands were dead or wounded. It was a triumph that felt more like a warning. In the days after Borodino, Napoleon continued his advance toward Moscow. On September the 14th, 1812, he entered the ancient Russian capital. Many in his army expected that this would finally end the war. In previous campaigns, seizing an enemy's capital had forced them to negotiate. But Moscow was not like Vienna, Berlin, or other European capitals. When French troops entered the city, they found it largely abandoned. Most of the population had fled. The Russian authorities had removed or destroyed food and supplies. Even more shocking, shortly after the French arrival, fires broke out across the city. The flames began in different districts, spreading quickly among the wooden houses and buildings. Whether the fires were set by retreating Russian officials, by arsonists left behind, or simply by accident in an occupied city, is still debated, but the result was unmistakable. Napoleon's great prize, Moscow, was engulfed in a firestorm. For days, giant pillars of smoke and sheets of flame consumed entire neighborhoods. The city that had been intended as winter quarters and a symbol of victory became a smoking ruin. Napoleon waited in Moscow for a Russian delegation to arrive, expecting Tsar Alexander to sue for peace. But no such offer came. Letters and proposals went unanswered. The Tsar had made up his mind. He would not negotiate while foreign troops occupied his land. Instead, he and his government called on the Russian people to resist, to harass the invaders, and to trust in the vastness of Russia and the approach of winter. As the weeks passed, the situation in Moscow grew dire for the French. Food was scarce. Shelter was inadequate. The men grew restless and demoralized. Behind them, long supply lines stretched back across devastated territory. Cossacks and Russian light troops harassed convoys and isolated units, cutting communications and ambushing stragglers. Each day that Napoleon delayed increased the danger. At last, in mid-October, with no peace in sight and the first chills of autumn hardening into real cold, Napoleon made a fateful decision. He would abandon Moscow and withdraw to the west. The retreat from Moscow began in October 1812, and it quickly turned from an orderly movement into a nightmare. The French hoped to move along a southern route rich in supplies, but Russian forces blocked their path. Forced back onto the road they had previously devastated, the Grande Armee had to retrace its steps through a land already stripped bare. The weather now turned decisively against them. Early frosts stiffened the ground. Then came snow and plunging temperatures. The soldiers, who had not been properly equipped for a full Russian winter, suffered horribly. Many still wore summer uniforms. Shoes fell apart, leaving men to wrap their feet in rags. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, noses, and ears. At night, soldiers huddled together around small fires, but many did not wake in the morning. Horses died in such numbers that guns and wagons had to be abandoned by the roadside. What had once been an impressive array of artillery was reduced to a scattering of guns, dragged by the few surviving teams of exhausted animals. The Russian army and irregular forces shadowed the retreat, striking whenever they could. Cossack cavalry swooped in on isolated groups, cutting down the unwary and capturing supplies. Skirmishes and ambushes further weakened the French. Hunger stalked the columns. With local food sources exhausted, many soldiers resorted to slaughtering the last of their horses or tearing apart abandoned wagons for scraps. Discipline began to crumble. Some men fell out of the line and tried to forage alone, only to vanish into the snow and darkness. Others clung to their units, driven forward by officers who themselves could barely stand. One of the most infamous moments of the retreat came at the crossing of the Berezina River in late November 1812. The French hoped to cross the icy river quickly to escape encirclement by converging Russian forces. But when they reached the river, they found the bridges destroyed. Under ferocious pressure, engineers and soldiers set to work building makeshift bridges from timber, wagons, and whatever materials they could find. As Russian artillery and musket fire rained down, crowds of soldiers, civilians, and camp followers surged toward the narrow crossing points in panic and desperation. The scene at the Berezina was one of chaos and tragedy. Men fell from the overcrowded bridges into the freezing water and were swept away. Wagons overturned. Horses collapsed. Those who tried to cross on foot risked being trampled or driven into the river. Amid this confusion, heroic efforts by the French engineers and rearguard units kept the Russians at bay long enough for a large portion of the army to cross. But the losses were terrible. Thousands died on the riverbanks, on the bridges, and in the water itself. It was a narrow escape, but the Grande Armée that emerged on the far side was a mere shadow of the force that had crossed into Russia months before. As the survivors staggered westward toward the frontier, the winter continued to exact its toll. Snowstorms swept the landscape. Temperatures dropped even lower. Entire groups of soldiers collapsed on the march and never rose again. For many, the retreat became a blur of hunger, cold, and exhaustion. When they finally recrossed the Niemen and left Russian soil, only a fraction of the original army remained under arms. The numbers vary among sources, but it is clear that the Grande Armee had been shattered. The consequences of Napoleon's invasion of Russia were immense. Militarily, it was a catastrophe. The myth of French invincibility was broken. Across Europe, former allies and subject states saw an opportunity. Prussia and Austria would soon shift against Napoleon. A new coalition began to form, determined to finish what Russia had started. Within 2 years, Napoleon would be defeated, forced to abdicate, and exiled. The Russian campaign marked the beginning of the end for his empire. But beyond the political and military consequences, the invasion of Russia left a deep imprint on memory and culture. It became a symbol of overreach, of the dangers of hubris, of what can happen when an ambitious leader underestimates geography, climate, and the resilience of a people determined to resist. Stories of frozen soldiers burning Moscow and the long trail of bodies in the snow traveled across Europe. Paintings, memoirs, and novels would retell the events of 1812 again and again, each emphasizing different aspects of courage, suffering, or folly. Napoleon himself, in later years, tried to explain away the disaster. He blamed the weather, the Russians' refusal to give a decisive battle after Moscow, and the failure of allies to fully support his campaign. Yet even he could not deny the scale of the catastrophe. What was meant to be a swift strike to force Russia's submission became a grinding war of attrition, fought across vast distances and in brutal conditions. The invasion of Russia in 1812 stands today as one of history's most famous warnings. It reminds us that power has limits, that not every enemy can be forced to follow a script, and that nature itself, whether in the form of distance, climate, or the harshness of winter, can shape the fate of empires. For the men of the Grande Armée, it was not an abstract lesson, but a lived reality. They entered Russia in proud, shining columns under summer skies. They left as scattered, frost-bitten remnants trudging through the snow. Between those two moments lies the story of ambition, resistance, endurance, and tragedy that we remember as Napoleon's invasion of Russia.